The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in a rhythm that never changed, a sound Katie Rodriguez had learned to filter out like background noise in a crowded bar. She'd been doing this for 3 years now, showing up, keeping her head down, letting the hospital rhythm move through her without resistance. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee mixed with something metallic that she'd stopped trying to identify. She knew better than to ask questions about the smells in an ICU. The St. Michael's intensive care unit stretched across the 3rd floor of the Denver hospital like a maze someone had designed specifically to test your patience. Cold stainless steel gleamed under harsh white light. Monitors beeped in overlapping rhythms that somehow made sense if you listened long enough. Katie moved through the ward with a kind of invisible efficiency that only came from people who understood that attention was a liability. She checked vitals, adjusted drips, documented observations. She did the work no one else wanted to do. She did it quietly. The shift started at 0600, and by 0630 the unit was alive with controlled chaos. Residents clustered around workstations. Attending physicians reviewed charts. Nurses moved in their practiced orbits, each person knowing exactly where they fit in the hierarchy. Katie fit nowhere. She was 52 years old, had walked in with a resume that had a 5-year gap she wouldn't explain, and wore her scrubs like they were camouflage. The hospital had hired her because the accreditation board wanted diversity numbers and Katie needed work. It was a transaction. Everyone understood that. She pulled her locker open at the start of her shift and pressed her hand against the worn jacket hanging inside. The faded unit patch was sewn into the lining where no one could see it unless they looked. She'd sewn it there herself with needles she'd borrowed from the pediatric floor. The patch showed colors that had faded from too many years in a desert, reds and blacks and golds that meant something to people who'd been there. She pressed her forehead against the fabric for exactly 3 seconds, the way she did every morning, and then closed the locker. No one watched her do this. No one ever watched Katie do anything. By 0700, Dr. Hargrove arrived on the unit like a man who'd never met a door that didn't open for him. He was 63, shaped like someone who'd spent his entire adult life in comfortable positions, with the kind of voice that made people immediately concerned about disappointing him. He had a surgical residence to oversee, 3 attending positions to manage, and the kind of authority that came from being the son of someone whose name was on a building in Boulder. He also had a particular way of moving through the ICU that made the junior residents tense and the nursing staff invisible. Katie was checking the line on a post-op patient in room 312 when the code alarm screamed from room 319. The sound cut through everything, that specific wail that meant a heart had stopped doing what hearts were supposed to do. She moved toward the sound without thinking. This was how you survived in intensive care. You moved toward the alarms, not away from them. The room was already crowded when she arrived. The patient was a 74-year-old man with a post-CABG infection that had been slowly getting worse despite aggressive antibiotics. His monitor showed a flat line that looked like someone had drawn it with a ruler. Hargrove was already there, sleeves rolled up, radiating the kind of confidence that came from knowing that your mistakes were rarely examined by people your own age. "Start compressions," Hargrove said to no one in particular. 2 residents jumped. One of them was competent. The other looked like he was trying to remember something from a textbook he'd read 6 weeks ago. Katie could see the problem in the first 30 seconds. The rhythm on the monitor wasn't responding the way it should have. The patient's pupils were blown. The timing of the medications was off by the way Hargrove was barking orders. He was ordering an epinephrine push before the compressions had even cycled, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, heavy and metallic and taking up all the space in the room. The dose he was calling for would have been correct for a 170-pound man. This patient weighed maybe 120. Katie's hands moved. She pulled the epinephrine vial from the crash cart, 1 milligram in 10 milliliters, and held it at an angle where Hargrove could see it. She didn't speak. She'd learned in year 1 that speaking to Hargrove when he was in this state was like trying to redirect a car after it had already left the road. Her job was to hand him the tools and stay out of the narrative. Hargrove glanced at the vial. And then he glanced at Katie's hands. "Jesus," he said, loud enough for the 2 residents and the nurse from the adjacent bed to hear. "Look at those tremors." How long have you been holding that? Katie didn't move. Her hands were steady. They were as steady as they'd ever been. The slight movement he was seeing was the natural drift that came from holding anything still, her fingers adjusting to the weight of the vial, micro-movements that didn't mean anything except that she was human. I said, "How long?" Hargrove's voice had taken on the tone he used with medical students who hadn't done the reading. 30 seconds, she said. 30 seconds and you're already losing fine motor control. That's either nerves or something more serious, Rodriguez. Either way, hand that off. He turned to one of the residents. Here, you push it. Maybe younger hands will keep the patient alive. The young doctor, name tag said Dr. Brennan, his face the color of someone's surprise, took the vial and injected it into the fall line. The monitor showed what it had already been showing, a patient who wasn't coming back. The code continued for another 11 minutes. Katie kept working. She moved between the family members who'd gathered at the door, getting one of them water, making sure they understood that they couldn't stand directly in front of the emergency exit. She was good at the invisible parts. When Hargrove finally called it, his glance at Katie held something between contempt and certainty. That's the problem with getting people who aren't trained in real environments. You get people whose nerves fail them in actual pressure situations. The room went quiet. The kind of quiet where every person in it became aware of their own breathing. Katie bent down and began picking up the scattered papers from the crash cart, discarded supplies, notes, the continuous documentation that came with every code. Her jaw tightened. Not visibly. Just a small clenching of muscle that only someone trained to read faces under stress would have noticed. She picked up each paper with the care of someone sorting something precious, her movement slow and deliberate. Hargrove was still talking. He had an audience now, the residents clustered around like residents always did when an attending wanted them to understand something. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. "And next time, wait for a real medical professional before adjusting medications." She hadn't adjusted any medications. She'd handed him a vial. The problem with diversity hiring, Hargrove continued, his voice carrying across the entire unit now, is that you end up with people who aren't ready for the actual pressure of critical care. They're good at the paperwork. They're fine with the basics. But when everything hits at once, he shrugged. You get trembling hands and frozen brains. Katie stood up. She had all the papers now. She looked at Hargrove, and her eyes were flat and empty the way a still pond is empty, surface with nothing beneath. "Thank you for the feedback, Dr. Hargrove." She walked out of the room. She didn't rush. She didn't cry. She didn't retreat to a supply closet. She simply left and disposed of the papers in the biohazard bin outside room 318, washed her hands with soap that smelled like industrial lavender, and returned to her patients. But Hargrove wasn't finished. He'd already turned to the residents before she'd even left the room, and his voice followed her down the hallway. "I'll bet $50 she quits within a week. Just like all the other ones we've tried to integrate. They get one hard code and they realize they're not cut out for this work. Anyone want to take that bet?" No one took it. The residents understood how this worked. Hargrove's certainty was not the kind of thing you argued against. Katie continued her shift. She checked on post-op patients in rooms 301 through 310. She documented everything in the electronic medical record, vitals, fluid intake, output, observations. She did the 1,000 small tasks that kept an ICU functioning. She was invisible again, exactly the way she preferred. By 1900, the shift had changed over and she was packing her things. The unit was quieter now, that strange calm that came at night when the hospital was running on skeleton crews. She pulled on her jacket, the one with the patch sewn into the lining, and walked out into the Denver evening. Her apartment was 17 minutes away by car. It was small, a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that had been built in 1987 and hadn't been significantly updated since. She'd chosen it specifically because it was unremarkable. The kind of place no one would ever think to look for anyone. She sat on the edge of her bed, still in her scrubs, and slowly pulled the jacket inside out. The patch was there, just as it had always been. Red and black and gold, colors that looked like fire if you weren't paying attention. Gunnery Sergeant Catherine Maria Rodriguez. That was who had sewn this patch. That was who had held it through 12 years of service, 3 tours, 2 Purple Hearts, and a husband who died while she was in Helmand Province. But that person didn't exist anymore. That person had walked away. She pressed her forehead against the patch and held it there for longer than 3 seconds this time. She held it until the cloth was damp against her skin and her hands had stopped being steady. Until the apartment was completely dark except for the city lights coming through the windows. No one knew what she had been. No one at St. Michael's knew that the woman they called a diversity hire had once held a Marine's arterial bleed closed with one hand while applying a tourniquet with the other. No one knew that the trembling Hargrove had mocked with something she'd learned to control 12 years ago, when control was the only thing that separated survival from death. She sat there alone, in the dark, holding on to the only piece of her old life that she'd kept, and she understood that by showing up, by taking the insults, by remaining invisible, she was choosing something. She was choosing to stay dead. 2 days passed in fluorescent silence. Katie moved through St. Michael's ICU like a current beneath surface, present but unnoticed, which was exactly how she preferred it. The initial sting of Hargrove's bet had faded into something else, a baseline awareness that she was being watched, judged, held to a standard that no amount of competence could ever satisfy. She understood the architecture of institutional power. She'd learned it in Helmand Province where rank meant everything and compassion was a liability. Here in Denver, the rules were just slower and duller. The cafeteria smelled like industrial gravy and something that vaguely resembled chicken. Katie balanced a tray, a water, black coffee, a roll she wouldn't eat, when Marcus from respiratory walked past, and in that split second of distraction, someone's elbow found her tray with surgical precision. Too clean. Too deliberate. The mashed potatoes exploded across her scrubs in a white cascade, and the timing was so perfect that Katie's first thought wasn't anger but professional admiration for the execution. At least 60 people in the cafeteria. All of them turned. Hargrove stood 3 tables away, and he didn't quite smile, but his eyes did. The attendant who'd thrown the elbow, or a third-year resident named Chen, no relation to her patient, mumbled a non-existent apology and disappeared into the crowd like smoke. Katie bent without a word, gathering scattered silverware, the tray, the napkins. Her jaw was tight, but her hands were steady. She'd held steadier things than silverware under fire. A nurse offered to help. Katie declined with a single shake of her head. No gratitude. No resentment. No emotion at all. Just a woman cleaning up a mess the world had made. Back at Sergeant Major Chen's bedside, she stripped off the soiled scrubs in the bathroom and changed into fresh ones, the fabric still warm from the linen cart. His vitals were stable, heart rate 68, BP 122/78, oxygen saturation 96 on room air. Good numbers. The kind of numbers that meant something. She checked his foresight, noted the slight warmth around the catheter, made a mental note to monitor for signs of infiltration. Her eyes went to the monitor screen, reading the rhythm the way other people read faces. Sinus rhythm. Steady. Alive. Rough morning, Rodriguez. His voice was hoarse but present. She didn't answer immediately. Sergeant Major Chen had served in Afghanistan, had commanded men in Helmand Province. She knew because she'd read his intake form 3 times, comparing dates, locations, battalion assignments. His 1st Battalion, 5th Marines had overlapped with her unit's operational area by 11 months in 2011. He might have known people she'd trained. He might have heard the call sign. She couldn't risk that conversation. Just a spill, she said finally, and his eyes tracked her face for a moment longer than felt safe, as if he was looking for something he recognized. Downstairs in his office, Hargrove was already moving. Katie didn't see it happen, but the architecture of it became visible over the next 6 hours in the way things shifted. A call to the Colorado Board of Nursing at 2:22 p.m., she watched him walk past the nursing station with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the measured tones of concern. "Just some questions about her background," he was saying. "The gaps are unusual. 5 years unaccounted for. No references from that period." By 3:56 p.m., an email landed in the department director's inbox from an investigator named Polk requesting personnel files. By 4:06 p.m., another call to the nursing school registrar in Boulder, this time with a question about the validity of her licensing exam. The web was spreading outward in concentric circles. Katie felt the pressure changes the way you sense a storm coming, not because she could see the lightning, but because the air itself was different. Her patient assignment stayed consistent. Her work evaluations remained on file, spotless. But the glances had changed. Subtle. Quick. The kind of look that came right before people decided whether you were worth defending. She said nothing. She charted her observations with clinical precision. She answered call lights. She monitored for sites for infiltration. She adjusted oxygen protocols based on readings. She was a good nurse, and being a good nurse meant becoming invisible enough that no one could examine you too closely. At 5:13 p.m., she was documenting Sergeant Major Chen's evening assessment when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. Not at her station. In the patient's room. His presence had the weight of something intentional. "Sergeant Major," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of genuine interest. "How are we feeling this evening? Any pain management concerns?" Chen's eyes shifted between them, reading the dynamic with the tactical awareness of someone who'd spent his career understanding human terrain. "Pain's manageable," he said carefully. "Rodriguez here's been taking good care of me." Hargrove nodded, but his attention was already moving away, as if Chen's endorsement meant nothing against the machinery he'd already set in motion. He paused at the doorway and looked back at Katie without any particular expression. "Good evening, Nurse Rodriguez. I trust the rest of your shift is less eventful." She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. "Long enough." "Not longer." "Yes, Dr. Hargrove." After he left, Sergeant Major Chen watched the space where the doctor had been. "That man," he said quietly, "doesn't like you very much." Katie adjusted the 4 drip rate and said nothing, which was answer enough. The phone calls continued through the week. 3 board members received calls from Hargrove's private line. The hospital's records would later show patterns, timestamps, a coordinated effort of concern. The nursing school registrar got another call asking specifically about the 5-year gap. An investigator named Polk began accessing public records, pulling driver's licenses, cross-referencing addresses, calling employers listed on applications. The net tightened in increments so small that Katie might have missed it if she hadn't been trained to notice when hunters were circling. She understood what he was doing. He wasn't trying to fire her directly. He was building a case. Strategic. Competent. The kind of systematic approach that assumed she would eventually crack or be cracked by institutional pressure. He was activating his network, board members who owed him favors, a registrar who wanted accreditation from his hospital, an investigator who got paid by the hour and didn't ask questions about motivation. It was professionally executed, and there was a certain dark respect in acknowledging it. But Katie Rodriguez had survived worse than phone calls and investigators. She had survived Helmand Province. She had survived her husband's funeral while deployed, receiving news that he'd died in a car accident in Colorado Springs while she was 8,000 miles away holding a tourniquet on a Marine sergeant with a blast wound. She had survived the nightmares that came after, the PTSD that had made her choose anonymity over the next promotion, healing over continuation. She had chosen this small life in Denver, this quiet ICU at St. Michael's, this invisibility that let her function without breaking. Hargrove couldn't break what was already shattered. He just didn't know it yet. She continued her rounds. She monitored her patients. She read the machines the way other people read literature, understanding the language of vital signs and cardiac rhythms. And in the evening, when the shift ended, she drove home to her apartment in North Denver, a one-bedroom place with walls thin enough to hear the neighbors' arguments, with a kitchen she never used, with nothing in the closet but scrubs and the jacket she'd worn to the funeral. Inside the jacket lining, sewn with meticulous stitches, was a faded unit patch. The emblem of the unit she'd served. The only piece of her old identity that existed in this new one. She held it sometimes in the dark, pressing the fabric against her chest the way some people said prayers. The code alarm screamed from room 347 at 0313 hours. A sound like a siren cutting through the quiet dark of the ICU, the kind of sound that stops time. Katie's eyes snapped open even though she was already moving. Her body knew this rhythm better than her mind did. The fluorescent panels above the hallway flickered once. Twice. Then held steady as she ran. Sergeant Major Chen was aspirating blood. She saw it before anyone said it, the dark fluid pooling at the corner of his mouth, his airway collapsing from hemorrhage complications that shouldn't have been there, the oxygen saturation monitor plummeting like a stone through dark water. 68, 62. 58, the numbers fell faster than anyone could speak. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen at the crash cart, his hands hovering uselessly over instruments he could not decide which to touch. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again without sound. Behind him, two residents copied his paralysis, their eyes locked on the monitor as if watching the numbers might somehow reverse them. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, growing increasingly desperate. Katie did not think. Thinking was a luxury she had abandoned 7 years ago in a combat hospital in Sanjin, where the rotor wash of incoming halos meant minutes, not hours. Where the difference between moving and hesitating was not promotion, it was a body count. She crossed the threshold of room 347 and her voice dropped an octave. Triage protocol. Move. It was not a request. It was a command, and her hands were already reaching for the equipment before anyone understood that the quiet nurse from the day shift was suddenly running the emergency response. The flashback hit her like a concussion blast. Not now. Not here. But her body remembered. Her body always remembered. The dust from the IED. The smell of copper and diesel fuel mixing with the hot metallic scent of blood on sand. The screams from the corpsmen as she'd steadied them through their first field amputation, a young Marine named Garrett whose leg was gone from the thigh down, his eyes locked on hers while she'd talked him through the tremors. Pain is information. Pain is data. We work the data. The mortars falling in patterns she'd learned to predict, the way explosions sound different when they're getting closer. Helmand Province in 2018, a forward surgical team running on coffee and adrenaline and the kind of focus that came from understanding that the next 3 minutes would determine whether 23-year-old Lance Corporal Martinez would walk again or spend the rest of his life in a wheelchair. She blinked. Room 347. St. Michael's ICU. Denver. 0314 hours. Katie was already reaching for the 14-gauge needle, her fingers moving with the terrifying precision of someone who had performed this exact procedure under conditions infinitely worse than this. The crash cart squeaked as she positioned it. Hargrove still had not moved. I need a 4.0 endotracheal tube. Size 4. Now. Her voice was ice water poured into a still room. The medical resident nearest to the supply cabinet, a young woman named Cassandra, moved without hesitation, understanding that the tone in Katie's voice was the kind of authority that came from somewhere deeper than any organizational chart. It came from someone who had held lives together with duct tape and prayer in places where the nearest hospital was 6 hours of dust roads away. The cricothyroid membrane was pale beneath Chen's skin. Katie could feel it even before she touched it, that hollow space where the airway could be restored if her hands did not shake. Her hands would not shake. They had not shaken in 17 years. She felt Hargrove step closer, a shadow at the edge of her vision. She did not acknowledge him. She did not have the luxury of his fear. The scalpel was already in her hand. The first incision, horizontal, through skin and tissue, swift and clean. The second cut, perpendicular to the first, opening the cricothyroid membrane itself. The third slice, and suddenly there was an opening, a window into the airway where oxygen could flow where it had been blocked. Tracheostomy tube. 7 mm. Cassandra handed it to her without a word. Katie inserted it, secured it, and immediately the patient's chest began to rise and fall with the kind of rhythm that meant survival. The monitor numbers began to climb. 68, 72, 79, 85, 88, 92. Stable. The silence in the room lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Hargrove's voice cracked like broken plaster. You can't. He's oxygenating, Katie said flatly, not looking at him. Saturation stable. The hemorrhage is controlled. She did not remove her hands from the patient's neck. Her fingers stayed exactly where they were, holding the tube in place, making sure it stayed. Get me 2 units of fresh frozen plasma and start a second full line. Type O negative, wide open. The resident moved. The nurses moved. Everyone in the room moved except Hargrove, who was still trying to understand how the quiet day shift nurse with the 5-year employment gap had just executed a procedure that required either extensive surgical training or field experience under conditions most doctors in Denver would never encounter. Katie was aware of his eyes on her hands. She was aware that her hands, the calloused palms, the small scars across her knuckles, the way her fingers moved with the muscle memory of someone who had done this exact procedure not in a simulation or a cadaver lab, but on living Marines bleeding out on stretchers in a tent with a generator humming outside, told a story that her resume did not contain. She was aware that she had just broken every rule about scope of practice and nursing protocols and the careful hierarchy that kept people like her in their place. But Sergeant Major Chen was breathing. His oxygen saturation held at 92. His heart rate had dropped from 142 to 108. The arterial bleeding had been controlled by the simple fact of an open airway that bypassed the hemorrhage point entirely. Katie did not look up at Hargrove. She did not meet the eyes of the residents, who were staring at her the way people stared at something that had just revealed itself to be other than what they had thought it was. She simply kept her hand steady on the tracheostomy tube and said to no one in particular, "Get me an OR available. Needs to be prepped for a proper surgical repair. And someone call the blood bank. Tell them we're going to need more than 2 units. I'm going on break," she added quietly, after the residents had scrambled out to execute her orders. "One of you stays with him. Monitor the tube placement. If the saturation drops below 90, page me immediately. And someone change those gloves. There's blood on the cart." The next words out of Hargrove's mouth changed everything, but not in the way he intended. "Who authorized you to?" Katie turned to face him for the first time since the alarm had sounded. She met his eyes with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst things a human being can experience. "Dr. Hargrove." The patient was hypoxic. Saturation below 60. Airway collapsing. Standard emergency protocol allows for intervention to prevent death. You were unable to act. I acted. The patient is now stable. She paused, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Unless you want to file a report explaining why you froze during a code, I suggest you let this one go. She pulled off her gloves with a single movement, the rubber snapping like a gunshot in the sudden silence. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The message was embedded in her posture, in the way she had moved through the emergency, in the technical precision of someone who had done this exact procedure while mortars fell and corpsmen screamed. Katie walked out of room 347 and down the hallway toward the break room that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams, leaving behind her a room full of medical residents and nurses who would spend the next several hours trying to understand what they had just witnessed, and a Dr. Hargrove whose hands were still shaking. The monitor flatlined at 0313 hours. Sergeant Major Chen's airway was collapsing, blood pooling in his throat, his oxygen saturation plummeting from 94 down to 87 to 79 like a plane losing altitude. Dr. Hargrove stood frozen beside the crash cart, his hands hovering uselessly over the defibrillator pads, his mouth opening and closing without sound. The residents scattered like startled birds. Katie moved toward the bedside without thinking, without hesitation, her body already knowing what her mind had spent 5 years trying to forget. She grabbed a scalpel from the instrument tray. The handle fit her palm like muscle memory made physical. One precise motion across the cricothyroid membrane, the small depression in Chen's throat where the windpipe met cartilage. The anatomy was identical to every anatomy, whether it was a Navy corpsman learning on a training dummy in Sanjin Valley or a Marine hemorrhaging in a Denver ICU at 3 in the morning. First cut. Clean. The blade moved like it was following a map written into her hands years ago. Second cut. Slightly deeper. Blood welled but didn't gush. Muscle memory took over, not panic, not hesitation, just the practiced precision of someone who had performed this in a combat trauma tent while mortar fire shook the walls and nurses held lamps because the generator had failed. Third cut. She positioned the makeshift airway, a 6mm endotracheal tube, the kind they had sitting on the crash cart. Her fingers moved with the terrible fluid grace of someone who had held this exact moment in her hands 247 times before, though no one at St. Michael's knew that number, that statistic, that weight. The tube slid into place. Air. Gasping, desperate air. Chen's chest heaved upward. The ventilator connected. The monitors beat back to life, oxygen saturation climbing, 62, 68, 75, 82, 89, and his heart rate steadied into something that wasn't tachycardia, something that wasn't dying. Sinus rhythm, someone whispered. The room went dead silent. Katie stepped back from the bedside without looking at anyone. Blood stained the cuff of her scrubs. Her hands were steady. They had been steady for 13 years, and they would remain steady until she was alone. She set the scalpel down with the gentleness of placing a child into a bassinet, turned toward the door, and walked out of room 347 like a woman leaving behind something she'd already mourned. Behind her, Hargrove's face had drained to the color of hospital walls. She made it to the break room that smelled like stale coffee and the particular despair of fluorescent lighting. She sat a day. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Her hands shook because they remembered Helmand. Her chest heaved because she'd promised herself 8 years ago that she would never do that again, never let her hands become weapons dressed up as mercy, never be the one who had to choose between amputation and death and somehow both. By 08:47 hours, Katie was sitting across from Director Chen and Dr. Hargrove in the administrative office on the 3rd floor. No coffee. No pleasantries. Just a manila folder, a pen, and the particular gravity of consequences landing. Ms. Rodriguez, Director Chen began, and Katie noticed he didn't meet her eyes. We've received a report regarding your actions in the ICU this morning. Dr. Hargrove has raised concerns about your scope of practice. Katie said nothing. Silence was a tactic that worked better than any defense. A cricothyrotomy is a surgical procedure, Hargrove said, his voice tight. Reserved for physicians. You performed emergency surgery without authorization. You endangered the patient. The lie sat in the office like humidity. The patient is alive, Katie said quietly. That's not the point. Hargrove's hands clenched. The point is protocol. The point is that you exceeded your authority. Director Chen slid the termination papers across the desk. His pen lay on top of them like a weapon. We're terminating your employment effective immediately, he said. For performing procedures outside your scope of practice. For insubordination. For refusing to disclose your professional references. Your 5-year employment gap in your personnel file has raised questions we can't resolve, and given this morning's incident, we cannot maintain confidence in your qualifications. Katie picked up the papers. They were 3 pages long. She read them without blinking. The words were careful, lawyered up, designed to provide protection from anyone asking questions. They didn't mention Hargrove's investigation. They didn't mention the calls he'd made to the nursing school registrar, or the private investigator he'd hired, or the fact that he'd spent 6 hours last week digging through records that didn't exist because Katie had made sure they didn't. She set the papers down. I'll need my badge, Hargrove said, extending his hand. His fingers were still shaking. He tried to hide it by clasping his other hand around it. Katie unclipped her hospital ID and placed it in his palm. The badge was warm from her body heat. She stood, pulled on her jacket. The faded unit patch sewn inside the lining pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, like a ghost, like all the things she'd sworn she'd left behind. By 1200 hours, her locker was empty. 37 months of shift schedules, 3 commendations from the nursing director, photographs of her with patients she'd helped care for through their final days, all of it fit into a cardboard box that the hospital gift shop had probably used for coffee mugs once. By 1800 hours, Katie stood at the riverside cemetery in the rain. Her husband's grave was simple. No marble angel. No elaborate epitaph. Just his name, Miguel Rodriguez, and the dates that showed he'd been 31 years old when he died, which meant he'd been dead for 7 years longer than they'd been married. The rain fell in sheets that sounded like static, like the white noise of every night she'd spent alone since then, like the sound of a life being erased. She didn't have an umbrella. She didn't need one. "I saved a life today, am I Amor?" she whispered to the stone. "And they destroyed me for it. I finally failed. After all these years, after everything I survived, I came here to be invisible, to be nothing, and even that wasn't enough. They found me. They always find you eventually." The rain soaked through her jacket. It ran down her neck in cold rivulets. Her hands were shaking now, actually shaking, not from restraint but from something deeper, something that had been building since the moment Hargrove's voice had first cracked across the unit, something that had accelerated when she'd felt the weight of the scalpel in her hand, something that had finally broken when Director Chen slid those papers across the desk. She pulled the unit patch from her jacket lining. The cloth was old, faded to the color of old photographs. It had been sewn by her mother 40 years ago with tiny stitches, 1 stitch per year of Katie's life. The edges were frayed. The insignia was barely visible anymore. For 13 years, this patch had been the only connection to who she'd been, and she'd kept it hidden like a secret, like a scar, like evidence of a crime. She held it in her trembling hands and almost threw it away. Almost let it fall into the mud, into the rain, into the cemetery dirt where it could rot and disappear the way she'd been trying to disappear. And then her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, standby for incoming. She stared at the message. Her thumb hovered over the delete button. She had no one. No one who would send military-style directives to a nurse she'd just met. No one who knew her address. No one who could possibly understand what incoming meant in the way that text meant it. And that was when she heard it. The distant thud of rotor blades cutting through the rain-thick air over Denver. Getting closer. Getting louder. She looked up at the sky. The patch was still in her hands. Her hands were steady again. The rain hammered down like recognition, like apology, like the world finally understanding what it had just done by letting her go. The sound grew until it wasn't distant anymore. By 1847 hours, for UH-60M Blackhawks descended toward the helipad at Denver Memorial Hospital, their rotor wash clearing the rain like a physical force. Katie stood in the cemetery watching the helicopters move through the sky with the precision of hawks, with the confidence of machines that owned the airspace, with the unmistakable shape of military authority making its entrance. She didn't move. She didn't need to. The helicopters had come for her. Within 40 minutes, Katie stood in the St. Michael's ICU while 12 service members in pressed uniforms lined the hallway. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound echoed through the corridor like a countdown. Like judgment. Like something massive finally arriving. A Master Chief Petty Officer, tall, dark-eyed, with the bearing of someone who'd spent 23 years perfecting the art of controlled presence, walked directly to her. He didn't extend his hand. Military protocol didn't require hands. Protocol required what came next. "Gunnery Sergeant Catherine Maria Rodriguez," he said. His voice could have cracked stone. "We need to talk about why you've been in Denver for 8 years working as a civilian nurse when you should have been in an office at the Pentagon. Katie said nothing. He added. The word hit differently than when Hargrove had used it. Behind him, Dr. Hargrove emerged from his office. His face went white. Actually white, the color of medical sheets, the color of a man who'd suddenly understood that he'd been fighting something he couldn't see, something with insignia and authority and the kind of reach that didn't stop at hospital administrators. The Master Chief turned slightly toward Hargrove. "Sir, you're Dr. Jonathan Hargrove?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. Yes. What's this about?" "Sir, I'm going to need you to remain here while we conduct a quick briefing for your staff. Don't move." Hargrove didn't move. Katie's eyes found Sergeant Major Chen in the ICU bed. He was awake. His trach tube was in place and functional. And his face, when he recognized her standing in the hallway surrounded by uniformed service members, transformed into something between shock and absolute certainty. He tried to speak. His voice came out hoarse, limited by the tube. "Devil medic," he whispered. Everything stopped. That's what we called her. In Sanjin. That's who saved my team." A Navy captain stepped forward. She had the bearing of someone who'd spent time in policy, in strategy, someone who dealt in classified briefings and decisions that affected thousands. She held up a tablet displaying Katie's service record. The screen glowed with decades of documentation. "Bronze Star," the captain said, reading aloud. Each word was its own sentence. Silence fell like death. Everyone waited. "Silver Star," she continued. The room held its breath. "2 Purple Hearts," the captain read. She paused. Let the weight settle. "And a Navy Cross." The captain looked up from the tablet. "For actions in Helmand Province on September 14, 2011. For running trauma operations while under direct fire. For refusing to evacuate when wounded. For saving 247 Marines across 76 engagements." The silence lasted exactly 10 seconds. Dr. Hargrove's mouth had gone slack. "Moreover," the captain continued, "your service record indicates you were assigned to JSOC Task Force 121 for 3 years, call sign Angel 6, before voluntarily separating following PTSD-related medical discharge." Katie closed her eyes. "You were married to Miguel Rodriguez, First Sergeant, who was KIA in 2016 while you were still deployed. You have a son, Miguel Jr., who is currently serving as a Lance Corporal with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, under the command of Sergeant Major Chen here. You requested civilian placement specifically in Denver to remain close to your son's unit's movements without direct contact, a decision made to protect him from attention while you recovered." The Sergeant Major tried to lean forward. His hand reached toward Katie. "Your son," the Master Chief said quietly, "received orders 3 hours ago about your situation. He wanted to be here. We advised against deployment of active duty personnel. Didn't want to compromise his position. But he wanted you to know that he remembers the letters you couldn't send. He knows why you disappeared. And he asked us to tell you," the Master Chief paused, "that he's proud of you." Katie's hands stopped shaking. The entire staff of the ICU was staring at her. Not at the trembling nurse. At Gunnery Sergeant Catherine Maria Rodriguez. At someone who'd held people together while everything was burning. At someone who'd chosen silence over glory, invisibility over recognition, the anonymous night shift at a Denver hospital over anything that would draw attention to her son. Hargrove's phone rang. Then vibrated. Then rang again. The Master Chief nodded toward a uniformed officer, who gently placed a hand on Hargrove's shoulder. "Sir, you're coming with us." "On what authority?" Hargrove demanded. "Federal Investigative Authority," the captain said flatly. "The investigation you initiated into Ms. Rodriguez's background triggered a secondary audit of St. Michael's financial records. Medicare fraud. Falsified patient charting going back 6 years. Approximately $847,000 in unauthorized billing. The FBI has had a file on you since Tuesday. Your medical license was suspended this morning pending criminal charges. You have the right to remain silent. Hargrove's face went from white to grey to the colour of a man who'd finally understood that he'd swung at something and hit something much harder in return. They led him out. Katie stood in the hallway of St. Michael's ICU in her worn scrubs, the unit patch still in her jacket pocket, finally visible to everyone around her, finally recognized for what she'd never stopped being, and she realized that some secrets don't need to be kept forever. Some secrets just need to wait for the right moment to breathe. 5 hours after her termination papers hit the shredder in Dr. Hargrove's office, Katie was collecting the last of her belongings from her locker, a stethoscope she'd bought with her first deployment paycheck, a trauma shear with her call sign engraved in fading script, a photograph of her son in dress blues that she kept face down, when the ER doors exploded inward and a gunshot victim came through on a stretcher, screaming in Pashto, thrashing against the paramedics with the wild panic of someone watching their own body betray them. Blood painted the tiles. His left side was a catastrophe, entry wound the size of a dime, exit wound the size of a fist, pneumothorax hissing air into his pleural cavity with every ragged breath. The trauma team scrambled. Dr. Patterson called out vitals with the calm precision of someone who'd done this 300 times. Pressure 88/62 and dropping, O2 sat 76%, heart rate 142. They were moving toward the trauma bay when the man's eyes locked onto Katie's across the chaos, and he gasped something that stopped time, Shaitan Tib. Devil medic. The words came out in Pashto, but Katie understood them the way you understand your own heartbeat, as something that exists inside you whether you acknowledge it or not. The stretcher slowed. People turned. The veteran Marine security guard, a man named Clayton with a tattoo of his unit crest on his forearm, went rigid beside the automatic doors, and his voice came out flat and declarative the way soldiers speak when they're stating facts that cannot be argued with. That's what the Taliban called a trauma surgeon who ran operations in Sanjin. That's what they whispered about. He raised his hand. It wasn't a gesture, it was a command. Stand down. Everyone stand down. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator in the adjacent bay wheeze its mechanical rhythm. Dr. Patterson looked at Clayton, then at Katie, then at the gunshot victim whose eyes had not left her face. That can't be. Patterson started, but he didn't finish because the hospital administrator, Dr. Winters, was already running toward them, his face pale, holding a manila folder with both hands like he was carrying a live grenade. He'd been pulling strings with someone. Katie would find out later it was a retired judge with Pentagon connections, and he had access to what the investigator had finally cracked, her full-service record. His hand shook as he read the first line aloud, Catherine Maria Rodriguez. Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. He kept reading, each word landing like a dropped weight in the terrible silence. 3 Navy Crosses. A breath. Long enough for someone to exhale. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Longer breath. Sergeant Major Chen, the man whose airway Katie had opened with a scalpel 36 hours earlier, was wheeled past on his way to his discharge physical, extubated now, breathing through the trach tube she'd created, his voice rough but present, and he saw what was happening, and he understood. He moved toward the crowd with the deliberate speed of a man still rebuilding his lungs, and he spoke to all of them. My son commands a platoon in 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. He wrote home about soldiers in his unit. About a trauma surgeon at Camp Leatherneck who held the line during a direct assault. They said she talked down a suicide vest bomber while simultaneously stopping an arterial bleed. Single-handed. They said she had hands that moved like they understood something the rest of us didn't. He looked directly at Katie. He said if he ever got hit, he prayed she'd be there. He didn't know she was here. He didn't know his mother had chosen to heal instead of fight. The administrator kept reading, voice cracking now, 247 combat saves. 247, cross-referenced and verified. Someone started clapping. It was a nurse from the ICU, a woman Katie had never spoken to, someone she'd only nodded at in passing, and then another person joined, and then another, until the sound filled the trauma bay like applause in a cathedral, not celebratory, but reverent, the way people clap when they've just understood something fundamental about someone they thought they knew. Katie didn't move. Her hands remained steady. Her face remained level. This was the moment where someone was supposed to cry, supposed to acknowledge the weight of what had just been recognized, but she was still wearing the mask of the quiet nurse, the invisible woman, the composite of 17 years of learning to survive by being small. What broke the spell was Dr. Winters opening a second file, not Katie's record, but another one, and his voice shifting from "or" to something harder. "We found this during the credentialing audit triggered by the initial investigation." He held up a stack of documents stapled at the corner, pages yellowed with time. Patient chart falsifications dating back for years. 3 Medicare fraud cases tied to inflated billing codes. Unnecessary procedures authorized without proper consent forms. He said the name slowly, each syllable a nail in a coffin: Dr. Harrison Hargrove. Medical license suspended pending criminal charges. FBI has been notified. Hargrove didn't arrive until the room was already dismantling the structure of his authority. He came through the trauma bay doors like he'd come through 100 doors before, head forward, jaw set, the posture of a man accustomed to the world bending to his presence, and he stopped. He saw Clayton standing with his hands at his sides, standing with the particular stillness of someone who'd been trained to hold power without needing to display it. He saw the administrator reading from federal documents. He saw Katie Rodriguez standing in the center of the room, surrounded by applause, her hand steady, her face unreadable. And he saw Sergeant Major Chen looking at him with the precise, measuring expression of a field officer assessing a tactical situation. Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. His face hemorrhaged color the way tissue loses blood flow, from the edges inward, white spreading across his cheekbones, his jaw, his neck. He fumbled for his phone, but Clayton was moving, not fast, just with the inexorable momentum of someone whose job it was to move people, and he placed one hand gently on Hargrove's wrist. "Don't," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a command. "You're coming with us. FBI's in the lobby." Hargrove's voice came out fractured, the composure shattering like tempered glass. "You don't understand. I have hospital credentials. I have tenure. I have board members who will." His voice cracked and rose. She falsified her own credentials. She practiced outside her scope. She should be the one standing there, not, and then he was shouting, incoherent, his reputation collapsing in real time, his carefully constructed authority burning away like paper in fire, staff backing away from him as if chaos were contagious. 2 federal agents in dark windbreakers entered from the trauma bay doors, and Hargrove made a lunge toward the patient records, whether to destroy them or to grab something. No one would ever be entirely certain, and they moved on him with the economical precision of people trained for exactly this scenario. Cuffs. Double locked. His wrist bone making a sound like a cricket snap against the metal. They walked him toward the elevator, past the staff, past the applause that had stopped, past the silent stares of nurses he'd mocked, residents he'd belittled, everyone he'd convinced himself was beneath him. One of the agents opened the file again as they moved. "Securities fraud, too. Looks like you were selling stock in a competitor to your brother-in-law and didn't disclose the conflict." The elevator doors closed on his voice, still shouting, still trying to negotiate his way out of something that had already moved beyond negotiation. 6 months later, the faded unit patch, the one Katie had sewn inside her jacket lining 17 years ago, the last piece of her old life she'd kept close, hung in a glass frame on the wall of her office at St. Michael's. The office had a window facing the mountains. Below the frame was a placard, Combat Trauma Excellence Award, established 2024, in honor of those who served twice. The walls of the office held documentation of the new program Katie had built, a trauma response protocol that factored in combat psychology, medical decision-making under extreme stress, the specific way the human body responds when your nervous system has learned to recognize danger in the shape of every shadow. Classes were being taught. Residents were being trained. Nurses from 7 different states had applied for the fellowship. Katie sat at her desk reviewing applications when her phone lit up with a notification from the hospital's personnel system. New application submitted. Rodriguez Combat Trauma Excellence Award, 18 applicants pending review. She opened the first application. A trauma nurse from a hospital in Tacoma, Washington. Experience, 7 years. The cover letter began, "I've seen things that don't fit into normal training. I've held people together when everything was falling apart. And I didn't know how to talk about it until I read about this program." Katie read it twice. Then she picked up the phone and made a note, "Schedule interview, Tuesday morning, 9:11 a.m. Outside her window, Denver sprawled beneath the October sun, the city indifferent to the transformations happening inside buildings, inside people, inside the quiet spaces where someone finally decides to stop running from who they are. Across the city in Aurora, in a strip mall sandwiched between a nail salon and a failing Subway franchise, a man in a name tag that read Steve was mopping the floors of an urgent care clinic, handling medical charts instead of writing them, following protocols instead of setting them. His hands, which had once commanded operating rooms, now wrung out a mop. Patients occasionally asked if he was a doctor. He flinched every time. He never answered. On Katie's drive home, she stopped at the cemetery. She didn't go to the grave every day anymore, the weight of it had changed, had become something she could hold without drowning, but today she went. She stood in front of the headstone, reading the name and dates the way someone reads a poem they've memorized but need to see written down. "I stopped running, Amor," she said quietly. "I'm still saving lives. I'm teaching others to save lives. And I'm not ashamed anymore." The wind moved through the cemetery like a living thing, carrying the sound of traffic from the highway, carrying the sound of leaves, carrying nothing that answered. But Katie stood there for another few minutes anyway, not waiting for a response, just bearing witness to the fact that she'd finally returned to a version of herself she thought was gone forever. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 17 years of holding everything inside, finally learning to breathe. When she got home, there was a handwritten note slipped under her door. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, military script. "Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez. This is Captain Hayes from the NCIS field office. We wanted you to know that Dr. Hargrove is cooperating fully with federal prosecutors. Your service record was used as evidence in his trial. Charges include healthcare fraud, Medicare fraud, securities fraud, and retaliation under federal statute. Thank you for your service. Once and always." Katie read the note 3 times. She didn't cry. She simply placed it on her kitchen counter beside a photograph of her son in dress blues, and made a note to call him, to tell him what his commanding officer had said, to tell him finally where she'd been all these years, to tell him that his mother had learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop fighting and start healing. What no one at the hospital knew yet was that Katie had already declined the offer to become chief of trauma surgery. She'd turned down the administrative role, the salary increase, the private office, because what she actually wanted was to remain in the ICU, hands moving across patient charts, teaching residents in real time, being present in the moment when someone's life balanced on the edge of a decision. The suit and the title could go to someone else. Her fight was here now. Her fight had always been here. She just needed to remember that fighting doesn't always look like combat. Sometimes it looks like showing up. Sometimes it looks like steady hands. Sometimes it looks like teaching someone else's hands to be steady too. Did you have any idea Katie was carrying a secret like this? Would you have noticed her, or would you have been just like Dr. Hargrove, dismissing someone based on what you could see instead of what they'd actually survived? Let me know in the comments, and if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real strength, share your story. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet ones who end up changing everything.